Hey, you finally found what you were looking for. As you listen to my voice and feel the gentle frequencies in the background, you'll notice your body beginning to sink deeper into your bed. Each breath slower, each muscle softer, and with every word, your thoughts become quieter. You can let go now. You can rest. This is your journey. Welcome to Dreams of Duty. Now, before we begin this journey, take a moment just to breathe. Breathe in slowly. Feel the air fill your chest and breathe out, letting everything go. Again, breathe in and breathe out. Each time, a little deeper, a little calmer. With every breath, your body softens, your thoughts drift further away, and the world outside becomes distant and quiet. You are safe here. You are calm. You are ready to dream. The year was 1754. Across Europe, tensions simmered in palaces, battlefields, and diplomatic chambers alike. The ambitions of monarchs and statesmen threatened to ignite one of the largest and bloodiest conflicts of the 18th century, a war that would stretch across continents, oceans, and peoples. At the center of Europe, the Austrian Habsburg Empire, under the determined and capable rule of Maria Theresa, sought to reclaim its lost territories from the humiliations of the War of the Austrian Succession. The fertile and industrially significant region of Silesia, lost to Frederick II of Prussia, had become a symbol of both personal and national pride. For Maria Theresa, regaining Silesia was not only a matter of territory, but of legitimacy, honor, and the survival of her dynasty within the fractious Holy Roman Empire. Opposite her stood Frederick II of Prussia, the man later known to history as Frederick the Great, a monarch whose military genius and personal ambition had already begun to reshape Central Europe. Frederick's eye was fixed not only on consolidating Prussia's hold over Silesia, but on expanding into the silver-rich lands of Saxony and Bohemia, territories that would strengthen his strategic position within the empire. His motivations were as much political as economic. By weakening Austria, he could assert Prussia as the preeminent German power, secure his dynasty's influence, and control trade routes vital for Prussia's economic future. Frederick's approach was methodical, disciplined, and unyielding, emphasizing rapid troop movements, strict drill, and the innovative application of linear tactics that made the Prussian army one of the most formidable in Europe. While Europe prepared, the distant colonies of North America were already a stage for conflict. Britain and France, long-standing rivals across both the Atlantic and the seas, had begun clashing over territories, trade, and alliances with indigenous peoples. In 1754, a series of skirmishes in the Ohio Valley, fueled by land disputes and competing claims, escalated into the French and Indian War, a localized precursor to what would soon become the 7 Years' War. British settlers, confident in their numerical advantage and the backing of colonial militias, began organizing armed patrols and fortifications. Meanwhile, French forces leveraged long-standing alliances with Native American tribes, including the Shawnee, Huron, and Algonquin, using knowledge of the land and guerrilla tactics to challenge the British and extend their influence. These early confrontations were brutal but localized, yet they foreshadowed a war that would engulf the globe. In Europe, the diplomatic landscape was fracturing. The once powerful coalition of Britain, Austria, Russia, and the Netherlands dissolved under financial disputes and conflicting military priorities. Britain, concerned primarily with defending its territories in Hanover against potential French incursions, grew frustrated with Austria's expectations for shared resources and territorial concessions. The Austrian Habsburgs, feeling betrayed and seeking security against France, turned to France itself, culminating in the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in May of 1756. Secret negotiations between Britain and Prussia produced the Westminster Agreement, which provided Frederick II with substantial financial aid in exchange for his commitment to defend Hanover. These diplomatic maneuvers set the stage for a war that would pit old allies against each other and create new coalitions defined by strategic necessity rather than historical friendship. Meanwhile, Russia, under the rule of Empress Elizabeth, viewed Prussia as its primary threat in northeastern Europe. Russian forces were already planning moves into East Prussia, with the expectation of exchanging conquered lands for strategic advantage. The Russian army, vast in number but uneven in training and leadership, would prove both a formidable force and, at times, an unreliable ally due to logistical challenges and political indecision. The complexity of European politics in the mid-18th century meant that alliances were fluid, plans shifted constantly, and even the most brilliant generals had to navigate a labyrinth of diplomacy, ambition, and espionage. By the summer of 1756, Europe was on the precipice of war. Frederick II, with his well-trained, highly disciplined army, prepared to strike decisively against opponents who outnumbered him, relying on speed, maneuverability, and tactical ingenuity. Austria, France, and Russia were coordinating forces across multiple fronts, while Britain, despite its naval superiority, faced the challenge of defending its continental possessions and supporting allies across the globe. The stage was set, armies were mobilizing, fortresses fortified, and diplomats maneuvering behind closed doors, all while the clock ticked inexorably toward a conflict that would engulf continents. The coming war would test the limits of logistics, endurance, and strategy. European monarchs would gamble entire armies for territory, glory, and national survival. Colonial governors and traders would see their lands and resources swept into the vortex of global conflict. Indigenous nations in North America and colonial populations in India and the Caribbean would be drawn into battles far beyond their initial understanding, often facing displacement, violence, and coercion as European powers pursued their ambitions. By the time the first shots were fired in earnest, the 7 Years' War had already begun to shape the destinies of nations and the contours of global power in ways few could yet imagine. This was the birth of a conflict that would come to be remembered as the first truly global war, a war defined not by a single battlefield, but by 1,000, stretching across continents, oceans, and cultures, laying the foundations of modern geopolitics and imperial rivalry. The calendar had turned to 1756, and Europe was already a continent bristling with tension. The diplomatic maneuverings of previous months had set the stage, But now the reality of war was beginning to unfold across multiple theaters. From the heartlands of Central Europe to the distant colonies of North America and the tropical regions of India and the Caribbean. The 7 Years' War, which would eventually be remembered as the first truly global conflict, was no longer a distant threat. It had begun in earnest. In Central Europe, the ambitious Prussian monarch, Frederick II, was determined to seize the initiative before his enemies could consolidate. His eyes were firmly set on Saxony, a prosperous but strategically vulnerable territory, whose ruler had maintained neutrality and friendly relations with Austria. On August 28, 1756, Russian forces, in accordance with their alliance with Austria, crossed the border into Saxony. They expected a swift campaign, believing that Prussia would be caught off guard by their overwhelming numbers. Frederick, however, had already anticipated such a move. Demonstrating the tactical brilliance that would later define his legacy, he maneuvered his army with rapid precision, aiming to convert the apparent threat into an opportunity. By October 1st, 1756, Frederick had already confronted an Austrian relief army under the command of Field Marshal Browne. With 29,000 well-trained Prussian troops, he faced 33,000 Austrians determined to secure Saxony. The battle that ensued, later known as the Battle of Loitz, highlighted the disciplined firepower and maneuverability of the Prussian army. While numerically outnumbered, Frederick's forces exploited superior training, rigid drill, and tactical deception, forcing the Austrians to retreat and leaving the Saxon forces with little choice but to surrender. In a move that would have lasting consequences, the Prussian king conscripted these surrendered troops into his own army, swelling his ranks while simultaneously weakening his enemy. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the North American theater of the war had escalated dramatically. The French and Indian War, which had been simmering since 1754, served as a prelude to the larger conflict now enveloping Europe. Both Britain and France were actively courting the support of local indigenous nations, recognizing that alliances with Native Americans could tip the balance in the dense forests and river valleys of the continent. France, benefiting from long-standing alliances with the Shawnee, Huron, and Algonquin tribes, leveraged this relationship to conduct highly effective raids, ambushes, and reconnaissance missions. The British, while maintaining relationships with the Iroquois Confederacy and some smaller tribes, faced challenges due to the often antagonistic interactions of colonial settlers with native populations. Despite this, Britain's demographic advantage, a population exceeding 1 million across the 13 colonies, allowed it to muster far larger militia forces than the French could, setting the stage for prolonged and bloody clashes. In the Indian subcontinent, the strategic port city of Kolkata, then Calcutta, became a focal point of imperial competition. In April 1757, the Bengali Nawab, Siraj-ud-Dawla, aligned with French interests, besieged and captured the city, dealing a significant blow to the British East India Company. This victory not only demonstrated the reach and influence of France in colonial affairs, but also highlighted the precarious position of British forces, who were stretched thin across multiple theaters. The capture of Kolkata served as a stark reminder that the war was not confined to Europe. It was truly global, affecting trade, colonies, and populations across oceans. Back in Central Europe, Frederick the Great was unrelenting. He recognized that facing Austria, France, and Russia, simultaneously would require not only tactical brilliance, but also an extraordinary endurance of his army. By 1757, Prussian forces were maneuvering across Bohemia and Saxony, engaging in a series of battles designed to delay and fragment enemy advances. At the Battle of Prague, Prussian troops initially achieved success, but were soon met with reinforcements under Austrian command. The ensuing conflict, known as the Battle of Kolin on June 18, 1757, resulted in a significant defeat for Frederick, who lost nearly half of his forces and most of his artillery. For the first time, the aura of invincibility surrounding the Prussian king was challenged. Even as Frederick faced setbacks, the intricate web of alliances and enmities across Europe continued to shift. France and Austria sought to capitalize on their numerical superiority, directing forces toward Hanover and Eastern Prussia. Yet logistical challenges, supply shortages, and the maneuverability of Frederick's forces often blunted the impact of these offensives. Small units of the Austrian army occasionally penetrated Prussian lines, capturing key cities such as Berlin for brief periods, only to retreat when confronted with the threat of counterattack. Frederick's survival, often attributed to a combination of tactical genius and sheer luck, demonstrated the fragile equilibrium that characterized 18th century warfare. Across the seas, Britain's position in North America and India began to improve. Despite early setbacks, such as the fall of Fort William Henry in August 1757, British forces gradually reorganized. Under the leadership of commanders like Robert Clive in India, Britain captured French settlements, secured trade routes, and defeated numerically superior forces through superior discipline, strategic planning, and the exploitation of enemy weaknesses. By the end of 1757, British forces had reclaimed momentum in several key theaters, demonstrating that the war, while global in scope, was a contest of strategic patience, adaptability, and endurance. The first year of full-scale conflict had shown both the possibilities and perils of a truly global war. Armies clashed across continents, navies contested the seas, and ordinary civilians were drawn into the chaos of conscription, taxation, and displacement. The 7 Years' War had proven in its opening chapters that no corner of the world would remain untouched, and that the ambitions of European monarchs could have consequences reaching from the frozen rivers of Eastern Europe to the tropical ports of India and the forests of North America. By the end of 1757, the stage was set for an escalation that would dwarf all previous expectations. Battles larger in scale, alliances more fluid, and the stakes far higher than any generation of soldiers or civilians could have imagined. Frederick II would continue to maneuver against overwhelming odds. Britain would leverage its growing global network to project power across oceans, and Austria, France, and Russia would all contend with the unpredictable brilliance of one man who refused to yield. The world was on the cusp of a conflict that would define the balance of power for decades to come. The calendar had turned to 1758, and the 7 Years' War had evolved from scattered engagements into a sprawling, coordinated conflict that spanned continents. Frederick II of Prussia, despite suffering significant setbacks the previous year, remained a formidable strategist. His army, though reduced in number due to casualties and disease, retained remarkable discipline and cohesion. Across Europe, The interplay of alliances, opportunism, and military maneuvering created a complex and shifting landscape. While across the seas, colonial powers extended the war to new theaters involving indigenous peoples, settlers, and mercenary forces alike. In Central Europe, Frederick recognized that his enemies, Austria, France, and Russia, continued to outnumber his forces substantially. The Russian army, boasting more than 300,000 men, moved toward East Prussia with intentions of occupation and territorial reorganization. Yet, despite the impressive numbers, Russian forces suffered from logistical inefficiency, poor coordination, and limited combat experience compared to the highly militarized Prussian army, whose ratio of soldiers to population was unparalleled in Europe. Frederick's strategy relied on mobility, surprise, and concentrated attacks against isolated enemy contingents, a tactic that would become his hallmark in the years ahead. By January 1758, Frederick had begun maneuvering through Silesia and Saxony, consolidating his positions and harrying supply lines of the Austrian and Russian forces. In early spring, the Prussian king executed a series of rapid strikes against scattered units, exploiting the disorganization of his numerically superior enemies. These operations were not only militarily effective, but also served to maintain the morale of his troops, who faced severe hardships, including harsh winters, scarce provisions, and relentless campaigning. Frederick's ability to inspire loyalty in his men, combined with his meticulous planning, allowed Prussia to withstand pressures that would have crushed lesser states. Meanwhile, in the North American theater, the conflict between Britain and France intensified. Following the capture of Fort William Henry in August 1757, French forces consolidated their positions in the northeastern regions, relying on alliances with Native American tribes such as the Shawnee, Huron, and Algonquin. British forces, although outnumbered initially, leveraged the growing population and militia capacity of the 13 colonies, raising new regiments and improving supply chains to support prolonged campaigns. By March 1758, British commanders had launched counteroffensives to reclaim lost territories, emphasizing the importance of fortifications, river control, and intelligence gathering from both settlers and allied tribes. In India, the British East India Company continued to capitalize on early victories in Bengal and southern regions. Robert Clive, commanding a force of professional soldiers and local sepoys, focused on consolidating territorial gains, fortifying key cities such as Calcutta, and disrupting French influence. The strategic significance of India lay not only in trade and resources, but also in its role as a theater that could indirectly influence European negotiations and alliances. By mid-1758, Clive had reasserted control over previously lost territories, demonstrating that even in distant theaters, disciplined forces and effective leadership could counteract the advantages of larger enemy contingents. In Europe, the summer campaigns of 1758 saw intense maneuvering and engagements across Silesia, Saxony, and western Poland. Frederick's forces, numbering around 60,000, repeatedly engaged with dispersed Austrian and Russian detachments. One notable engagement occurred near Leitz, where a portion of the Austrian army, pursuing Frederick's 27,000-strong force, was decisively routed. The Prussian king's ability to exploit timing, terrain, and intelligence allowed him to overcome what would otherwise have been insurmountable odds, reinforcing his reputation as a master tactician. Yet, the war's toll on civilian populations was severe. In Silesia, Saxony, and other contested regions, scorched earth tactics became common. Armies foraged, requisitioned supplies, and often resorted to looting towns and villages to sustain campaigns. Disease and famine followed in the wake of moving armies, causing suffering far beyond the battlefield. Frederick, acutely aware of the war's broader impact, attempted to regulate conduct among his troops, but the intensity and scale of operations often rendered such measures insufficient. By early 1759, the dynamics of colonial warfare also shifted. In North America, the British captured key strategic positions, including Fort Niagara, consolidating control over the Great Lakes and northeastern colonies. French forces, increasingly reliant on Native American alliances, struggled to maintain communications and supply lines, facing attrition both from military losses and the logistical challenges of the frontier. In India, the British East India Company advanced further into French-controlled territories, capturing important settlements and establishing a network of fortified positions. This not only secured trade advantages, but also allowed the British to recruit local forces more effectively, offsetting numerical disadvantages in certain regions. Back in Europe, Frederick faced renewed pressure from multiple fronts. The Austrian army, reorganized under the command of Charles of Lorraine, sought to reclaim Silesia, while Russian forces maintained their presence in East Prussia. Battles at Zorndorf in August 1759 exemplified the brutal intensity of these campaigns. The engagement, involving 33,000 Prussian soldiers against 42,000 Russians, resulted in massive casualties, approximately 11,000 for Prussia and 16,000 for Russia. Despite the lack of a decisive victory, Frederick regarded the battle as advantageous, having inflicted significant losses on his numerically superior adversaries. The simultaneous escalation in multiple theaters underscored the truly global nature of the conflict. In Europe, battles were characterized by massed infantry, artillery duels, and cavalry maneuvers, with commanders employing innovative tactics such as flanking maneuvers, oblique orders, and feigned retreats. Across oceans, naval and amphibious operations shaped the course of campaigns in the Americas, the Caribbean, and India. Colonial administrators and military leaders coordinated complex supply lines, engaged with local populations, and navigated the ever-shifting allegiances of indigenous nations and regional powers. By the close of 1759, the 7 Years' War had entered a phase defined by endurance, attrition, and strategic ingenuity. Prussia, though heavily outnumbered, remained a resilient force under Frederick the Great, while Britain began to assert dominance in colonial theaters. Austria, France, and Russia continued to press their advantages on the continent, yet logistical challenges, internal coordination issues, and the unrelenting tactical skill of Frederick prevented them from achieving decisive victories. The war had become not just a struggle of armies, but a test of leadership, supply management, diplomacy, and the resilience of nations stretched to their limits. As Europe, North America, and Asia settled into a precarious and bloody equilibrium, it was clear that the coming years would demand extraordinary efforts from every participant. The strategies, victories, and defeats of this period would shape not only the immediate course of the conflict, but also the geopolitical landscape for decades to follow. The stage was set for further escalation, larger campaigns, and the eventual emergence of Britain and Prussia as the primary victors of a war that had already demonstrated the full scope and horror of global conflict. By 1760, the 7 Years' War had reached a scale unprecedented in European history. The conflict, now in its 5th year, was truly global, spanning Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. Every major European power was fully mobilized, and the strategies employed demonstrated the intricate interplay between continental warfare, maritime dominance, and colonial expansion. In Europe, Frederick II of Prussia continued to confront multiple adversaries with remarkable efficiency. Despite being outnumbered by the combined forces of Austria, Russia, and France, Frederick relied on mobility, intelligence, and superior discipline. At the start of 1760, he maneuvered his forces into Silesia and Saxony, exploiting the fragmentation of the Allied armies. Skirmishes along key supply routes and outposts allowed the Prussian king to delay reinforcements, disrupt communications, and seize the initiative wherever possible. His campaigns during this year would set the stage for some of the most celebrated tactical maneuvers in military history. The Russian Empire, commanding a formidable army of over 300,000, continued to threaten eastern Prussia. However, logistical challenges and the difficulty of coordinating operations over vast distances hampered Russian effectiveness. Their army suffered from supply shortages, slow communication, and the frequent unreliability of inexperienced conscripts. Frederick, aware of these weaknesses, launched precise, concentrated attacks to isolate Russian detachments before they could consolidate, demonstrating his mastery of timing, terrain, and battlefield psychology. Meanwhile, Austria, under the command of Charles of Lorraine and other experienced generals, sought to reclaim Silesia while pressuring Prussia on multiple fronts. In spring 1760, Austrian forces initiated coordinated offensives into Bohemia and Saxony. Frederick, however, continued to rely on his famed oblique order, concentrating his forces against weaker enemy sectors and employing aggressive cavalry maneuvers. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Prussia inflicted significant casualties and retained control over key territories. The war in Europe at this time became a continuous series of maneuvers, sieges, and brutal engagements that tested the endurance of both armies and civilians alike. Across the Atlantic, North America remained a major theater of operations. Britain, leveraging its larger population and colonial militia forces, launched a series of offensives to regain territories lost to the French in previous years. The British captured strategic forts along the Street, Lawrence River, and in the Ohio Valley, including Fort Niagara, consolidating control over key trade routes and waterway access. The French, supported by allied Native American tribes such as the Shawnee, Huron, and Algonquin, continued to resist fiercely. Battles were often fought in dense forests, along rivers, and across difficult terrain, making logistics, reconnaissance, and local alliances critical to success. In India, the struggle between the British East India Company and French forces under local allies intensified. Robert Clive and his forces, consisting of British regulars and loyal sepoys, executed sieges, captured key settlements, and maintained critical trade and military posts. The capture of Chandanagar in 1757 had already shifted momentum, but French commanders attempted to regain influence in Bengal and along the eastern coast. By 1760, the British had solidified their position in the region, demonstrating the interconnected nature of European conflicts and colonial expansion. Control of ports and trading posts became as strategically significant as field battles in Europe, with economic resources directly affecting the ability to raise and sustain armies. Frederick's operations in Central Europe in 1760 also saw critical battles and skirmishes in Silesia and western Poland. Despite frequent numerical inferiority, Prussian forces repeatedly outmaneuvered Austrian and Russian detachments. One notable engagement involved Frederick commanding a force of 33,000 against an Austrian contingent of 77,000 near Hautzen. The Prussian king's ingenuity allowed him to avoid encirclement and inflict substantial casualties, although losses were heavy on both sides. The war of maneuver dominated the European fronts, with supply lines, reconnaissance, and terrain exploitation becoming decisive factors. Naval and maritime theaters added another layer of complexity. Britain's Royal Navy sought to dominate the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Indian Ocean routes, interdicting French and Spanish shipping, protecting colonies, and supporting amphibious operations. The capture of Havana and Manila by British forces in 1762, though slightly beyond this chapter's timeline, was the result of strategic planning and gradual control of surrounding sea lanes initiated during 1760. These operations demonstrated that naval supremacy was not merely a support function, but a decisive factor influencing the global outcome of the war. Internally, European powers faced logistical and economic strains. Prussia, despite victories in maneuver warfare, struggled to maintain sufficient reserves and supplies. Taxation, forced conscription, and the requisitioning of resources from occupied territories placed tremendous pressure on both soldiers and civilians. In Austria and Russia, coordination problems among Allied forces, compounded by disagreements over command priorities, prevented the full exploitation of their numerical advantages. These factors allowed Prussia, under Frederick, to maintain operational initiative despite the overwhelming odds. Diplomatic developments during 1760 further shaped the war. Britain, aware of the critical importance of alliances, continued to subsidize Prussia financially, ensuring the king could maintain and equip his army. France, seeking to support Austria and other continental partners, attempted to disrupt British colonial operations, while simultaneously pressuring Hanover and Western Germany. Russia, after significant attrition in prior engagements, focused on consolidating occupied territories and supporting Allied offensives, though inefficiency and slow mobilization limited their operational impact. The winter of 1760 saw relative pauses in European operations, as armies regrouped, replenished supplies, and conducted limited maneuvers. Prussian forces fortified key positions in Saxony and Silesia, ensuring readiness for the campaigns of 1761. Across the ocean, in North America, British forces established winter quarters near captured forts, preparing for renewed operations in the spring. The interconnected theaters of war required continuous attention to logistics, troop health, and coordination across thousands of miles. By the end of 1761, The 7 Years' War had demonstrated the evolving nature of global conflict. Military genius, numerical strength, logistical capacity, and colonial control all played interdependent roles in determining outcomes. Prussia, under Frederick the Great, maintained its resilience despite heavy losses and overwhelming odds. Britain, increasingly dominant at sea and in its colonies, laid the foundation for global supremacy. Austria, France, and Russia continued to struggle with coordination and strategic execution, highlighting the difficulties of multi-front warfare in an era without rapid communication. The stage was set for 1762, when renewed campaigns in Europe, North America, India, and beyond would push all combatants to their limits. As armies prepared to clash once more, the lessons of 1758 through 1761 remained clear. Superior strategy, disciplined troops, logistical excellence, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing conditions could offset even the most severe numerical disadvantage. The 7 Years' War, truly a conflict of continents, peoples, and oceans, continued to reshape the balance of power and redefine the very concept of global warfare. The year 1762 marked a decisive escalation in the 7 Years' War, with nearly every major power fully committed across multiple continents. After years of maneuvering, skirmishes, and limited engagements, the conflict now demanded large-scale campaigns, intricate coordination, and the mobilization of unprecedented resources. The global dimension of the war became ever clearer. Europe's great powers extended their ambitions into the Americas, the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Indian subcontinent, turning the war into a test of endurance, strategy, and logistical mastery. In Europe, Frederick II of Prussia faced the full weight of his adversaries' coalitions. Austrian forces under Leopold von Daun, reinforced by Russian contingents commanded by Wilhelm Fermor, continued to threaten Silesia and Saxony, seeking to reclaim territory lost in previous campaigns. Despite being outnumbered, Frederick's military acumen remained unmatched. Utilizing rapid marches, feints, and flexible deployments, he avoided encirclement and concentrated his forces against isolated enemy units. One notable campaign of 1762 involved Frederick's maneuvering against a combined Austrian-Russian army near the town of Berkersdorf. Facing a force of 75,000, Frederick commanded 44,000 soldiers. He leveraged terrain, fortified positions, and well-timed cavalry charges to stabilize his lines. The battle was brutal. Prussian infantry endured withering fire, artillery duels raged across hills and valleys, and countless officers and soldiers were lost on both sides. Though Frederick succeeded in forcing the Allied army to withdraw, the engagement exemplified the staggering human cost of the 7 Years' War. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in North America, Britain sought to consolidate and expand its colonial gains. British commanders, now commanding a combined force of regular troops and colonial militias, advanced upon strategic French forts and settlements along the St. Lawrence River, the Ohio Valley, and the Great Lakes. In the summer of 1762, British forces captured Fort Carillon, although French resistance and support from allied Native American tribes made every advance costly. Supply lines had to be meticulously planned to navigate vast forests, rivers, and rugged terrain, and winter campaigns required careful preparation to avoid starvation, disease, and attrition. France, despite setbacks, continued to exert influence in North America through alliances with local Native American tribes. The French understood that their population was dwarfed by British settlers. Thus, every military engagement required maximizing the impact of each soldier and leveraging guerrilla tactics and ambushes. These confrontations shaped a brutal, drawn-out contest in which control of forts, rivers, and trade routes dictated the momentum of the war. In India, the conflict between the British East India Company and French forces allied with local rulers intensified. By 1762, Robert Clive and his forces, alongside local sepoys, conducted sieges, secured trading ports, and defended British-held territories against French-backed armies. The capture of strategic locations, including the French-held city of Pondicherry, showcased the importance of European military practices integrated with local alliances, intelligence networks, and naval support. These campaigns were a microcosm of the global war, where local geography, culture, and politics directly affected the outcomes of battles. The naval theater was equally decisive. Britain's Royal Navy, leveraging its experience and industrial capacity, sought to disrupt French and Spanish trade, protect colonial holdings, and project power across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. In 1762, British fleets patrolled critical sea lanes, blockaded French ports, and enabled amphibious landings that would become decisive in the Caribbean and North America. France and Spain, unable to match British naval supremacy, were forced into defensive operations, losing control of key territories and suffering supply shortages that affected their armies abroad. Back in Europe, the campaign of 1763 witnessed renewed offensives in central Germany. Frederick's armies, now numbering 60,000, faced an Austrian force of 85,000 under Charles of Lorraine. Employing his signature oblique order and concentrating firepower on weaker enemy sectors, Frederick achieved tactical victories at several minor engagements, forcing the Austrians to retreat to fortified positions. However, attrition, disease, and the relentless pressure of multi-front war had begun to deplete Prussia's elite units. Every victory came at a significant cost, illustrating the delicate balance Frederick had to maintain between daring maneuver and preserving his army's combat effectiveness. In North America, British forces turned their attention to the St. Lawrence Corridor. The strategic capture of Quebec, planned over months of reconnaissance, training, and logistical preparation, became the central objective. British commanders understood that controlling the heart of New France would decisively weaken French influence in the continent. Despite the formidable terrain, fortified positions, and determined French resistance, British forces advanced systematically, using artillery bombardments, riverine movements, and coordinated militia attacks. French losses mounted, and the native alliances that had once strengthened their position began to falter under continuous pressure. Meanwhile, the Caribbean saw a series of brutal amphibious operations. Britain targeted French-held islands, capturing strategic ports and disrupting vital sugar trade routes that funded French military efforts in Europe. Disease, tropical storms, and the challenges of maintaining supply chains in remote colonies added layers of complexity to the British campaigns, requiring careful planning and adaptability from both officers and soldiers. By 1764, Frederick's position in Europe had stabilized, but he remained aware of the precarious nature of his victories. On the continent, Austria, France, and Russia continued to mobilize forces for renewed offensives, though coordination remained challenging due to geographic distances, differing command structures, and logistical hurdles. Prussia's survival relied on a combination of rapid movement, strategic foresight, and the exploitation of enemy errors. Across the world, Britain's colonial and naval dominance was increasingly evident. The capture of Quebec in the late 1764 campaign effectively ended major French influence in eastern North America, allowing Britain to consolidate control over the colonies. Simultaneously, British forces in India strengthened positions in Bengal, the Coromandel Coast, and other critical regions, while French forces increasingly struggled to maintain cohesion and supply. The 7 Years' War, during these years, revealed the interplay between European conflicts and colonial ambitions. Wars were no longer confined to continental borders. Battles in Europe affected operations in India, North America, and the Caribbean, while colonial struggles influenced strategic decisions in the heart of the continent. Prussia's survival against overwhelming odds, combined with Britain's global colonial successes, underscored the evolving nature of warfare. Strategy, logistics, and the integration of multiple theaters had become as decisive as sheer numbers or bravery alone. By the end of 1764, the world had already witnessed a shift. Britain and Prussia had demonstrated resilience and adaptability, setting the stage for further engagements in Europe, India, North America, and beyond. Austria, France, and Russia, despite occasional victories, faced mounting logistical and operational challenges. The stage was set for a continuation of global conflict in 1765, where naval supremacy, colonial control, and the fortunes of armies across continents would determine the ultimate outcome of the 7 Years' War. The year 1765 marked a pivotal phase in the 7 Years' War. Prussia, having survived the numerically superior coalitions in Central Europe, faced renewed pressure from Austria, France, and Russia. Frederick II, now widely acknowledged as Frederick the Great, continued to rely on rapid maneuvering, disciplined troops, and audacious tactical plans to counter forces that often outnumbered him twofold or threefold. Meanwhile, across the globe, the war intensified in North America, India, and the Caribbean, reflecting the fully global character of the conflict. In Central Europe, Frederick's primary concern was the preservation of Silesia, whose fertile lands and industrial output were vital to Prussia's economy and war effort. Austrian forces under the command of Field Marshal Leopold von Daun sought to recapture the province. The Austrians meticulously fortified positions along the Oder River, anticipating a Prussian attempt to advance. Frederick, recognizing the risk of a frontal assault, employed his classic oblique order, concentrating forces on a specific sector to break the enemy line, while holding the remainder in a defensive posture to absorb counterattacks. This approach allowed him to achieve localized victories despite overwhelming opposition. During the summer of 1765, a major engagement unfolded near the town of Prague, where Prussian forces numbering 45,000 faced a combined Austrian-Russian army of 80,000. Frederick conducted a rapid flanking maneuver, forcing a partial collapse of the Allied left wing. Casualties were high on both sides, Prussia lost nearly 10,000 soldiers, including experienced officers whose absence would be felt in subsequent campaigns. The Allied forces suffered greater overall losses, but retained enough strength to prevent a decisive Prussian conquest. The battle underscored the war's bloody and attritional nature. Tactical brilliance could achieve temporary successes, but strategic stalemates remained common. Meanwhile, in North America, the war had reached a critical juncture. British forces, now fully committed to dislodging the French from strategic positions, conducted a series of coordinated campaigns in the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes region, and along the St. Lawrence River. In 1765, the British launched the Siege of Fort Niagara, combining regular troops, colonial militias, and allied Iroquois forces. The French defenders, supported by Algonquin and Huron allies, fought tenaciously. However, the British gradually tightened their encirclement, employing artillery bombardments and riverine blockades to cut off supplies. The fort eventually fell, marking a significant British gain in controlling access to the Great Lakes and reinforcing the strategic value of alliances with Native American tribes. In India, British and French forces continued their struggle for dominance over key trading cities and strategic ports. Robert Clive, now commanding seasoned forces, coordinated joint operations with local allies, targeting French settlements in Bengal, the Coromandel Coast, and Mysore. The French, despite attempting to reinforce positions with European troops, struggled to maintain cohesion amid logistical difficulties, tropical disease, and the vast distances between theaters of operation. By late 1765, British control over critical regions, including Kolkata and Madras, solidified, allowing for more aggressive campaigns in subsequent years. The Caribbean theater witnessed ongoing amphibious operations as Britain sought to weaken French and Spanish colonial economies. British fleets, projecting naval power across the Atlantic, captured key islands and disrupted the flow of sugar, coffee, and other valuable commodities. French and Spanish forces, while resilient, were hampered by disease, insufficient reinforcements, and limited naval capacity. By 1766, British forces controlled a majority of the critical sea routes, enhancing their ability to supply troops and project power across multiple theaters. In Europe, the year 1766 saw renewed pressure on Prussia from multiple directions. Austria, under Charles of Lorraine, sought to regain momentum through a series of offensives in Silesia and Saxony. Russian forces, meanwhile, threatened East Prussia, intending to strike at the heart of Frederick's domains. Despite these challenges, Frederick's forces, though diminished in number, employed rapid marches, fortified camps, and aggressive reconnaissance to stay one step ahead. Small-scale skirmishes, raids on supply lines, and defensive entrenchments became the hallmark of this period, demonstrating the evolving nature of 18th century warfare, where mobility, logistics, and timing could offset numerical inferiority. North American operations intensified during 1766 as Britain pursued French positions along the St. Lawrence River. Quebec remained a central objective. British forces employed coordinated land and naval maneuvers to isolate French defenders, cutting off reinforcements from Montreal and other French settlements. Native American alliances shifted during this period, as the British offered promises of protection and trade, gradually undermining French influence. By the end of the year, British control over large portions of strategic territory in the northeast was increasingly secure, signaling the decline of French power in North America. In India, the British East India Company expanded its operations to southern territories and inland regions. Battles in Mysore, Bengal, and along the Coromandel coast demonstrated the strategic interplay between European military discipline and local alliances. French forces, though experienced, could not match British organization, reinforcements, or naval supply lines. By late 1766, British forces had consolidated their hold over key trading posts, giving them leverage over regional rulers and setting the stage for further expansion in the subcontinent. The year 1767 opened with renewed campaigns in Europe. Frederick the Great faced Austrian attempts to capture Silesia once more, as well as persistent Russian threats in East Prussia. Frederick, acutely aware of the limits of his forces, focused on striking isolated enemy units and avoiding large-scale engagements where possible. Skirmishes, sieges of minor fortifications, and harassment of supply convoys characterized the conflict. Attrition, disease, and exhaustion continued to reduce the effectiveness of all armies, underscoring the brutal reality of prolonged continental warfare. North America, however, saw a decisive advantage shift toward Britain. By 1767, British forces completed campaigns that consolidated control over the Strait, Lawrence Corridor, and the Ohio Valley. French defenders, isolated and unable to receive sufficient reinforcements from Europe, gradually lost territory. Native American alliances, while fluid, increasingly favored the British due to pragmatic considerations of survival and trade. This series of victories solidified British dominance in eastern North America, presaging the eventual complete conquest of French Canada. In India, the British continued systematic operations against French strongholds. By late 1767, British forces had captured critical fortresses, established administrative control over major regions, and ensured naval superiority along the Coromandel coast. French influence receded to limited coastal enclaves, increasingly dependent on reinforcements from Europe that were slow and costly to mobilize. The campaign highlighted the interconnected nature of European and colonial warfare, where control of supply lines, alliances with local rulers, and effective coordination between land and naval forces determined success. By the end of 1767, the global nature of the 7 Years' War had become undeniable. Europe remained embroiled in complex maneuvers, sieges, and battles, while across the oceans, British forces in North America and India steadily weakened French and Spanish influence. Frederick the Great's Prussia, despite facing overwhelming odds, retained its territories through tactical brilliance and disciplined armies. Britain's growing colonial and naval supremacy foreshadowed the eventual outcome of the war, although the costs in manpower, resources, and economic strain continued to mount. The stage was set for the years 1768 and beyond, where Europe would see intensified campaigns, Britain would push for complete dominance in colonial theaters, and the fragile alliances of continental powers would be tested to their limits. The 7 Years' War had become not just a European conflict, but a truly global struggle, shaping the political, economic, and military landscapes of the world for generations to come. The year 1768 opened with a precarious balance in Europe. Frederick II, King of Prussia, continued to face a coalition of Austria, Russia, and France, while Britain sought to consolidate its growing influence overseas. After nearly 13 years of sustained conflict, exhaustion began to touch all participants. Yet ambition, national prestige, and the pursuit of strategic advantage kept the war raging across continents. In Central Europe, Austria and Russia attempted to coordinate multi-pronged offensives to reclaim Silesia and Eastern Prussia. Frederick, acutely aware of the coalition's numerical superiority, relied on mobility, intelligence, and fortified positions to offset the odds. Skirmishes and minor battles dominated early 1768, with both sides suffering attrition and logistical strain. Disease, especially dysentery and typhus, plagued encamped soldiers, significantly reducing combat effectiveness. Nonetheless, Frederick's emphasis on discipline and training ensured his troops remained cohesive, despite being outnumbered on several fronts. By the spring of 1768, Prussian forces conducted aggressive raids into Austrian-held Saxony. These actions were aimed at disrupting supply lines, gathering intelligence, and testing the readiness of Allied forces. At the same time, Austrian Field Marshal Leopold von Daun fortified defensive positions along key river crossings, preparing for the inevitable Prussian assault. Small-scale engagements along the Saale and Elbe rivers demonstrated Frederick's enduring tactical ingenuity. The oblique order, rapid cavalry maneuvers, and concentrated artillery barrages allowed him to achieve localized victories even against numerically superior enemies. Meanwhile, in North America, the British continued their campaigns against French positions. The siege of Louisbourg, initially begun in the preceding years, had been partially consolidated, and British forces pushed further into the St. Lawrence River corridor. French forces, still relying on Native American allies, struggled to maintain cohesion and supply. The British, leveraging their superior population and disciplined militia regiments, began to secure strategic control over the Atlantic coast and inland trade routes. By mid-1768, British control over Nova Scotia and parts of Acadia had been solidified, further isolating French settlements and weakening morale among colonial French troops. In the Caribbean, the British sought to disrupt French and Spanish sugar-producing colonies. Naval engagements increased in frequency, with the British Royal Navy asserting dominance over key sea lanes. Fleets from both sides engaged in cautious maneuvers, aiming to protect convoys while threatening enemy ports. Disease and the tropical climate played as large a role in weakening forces as any combat operations. By the end of the year, Britain had successfully captured several French-controlled islands, further consolidating their economic position and reinforcing their naval supremacy. India continued to be a theater of intense competition. Robert Clive and the British East India Company maintained pressure on French holdings along the Coromandel coast and in Bengal. By 1768, the British had captured critical fortifications and gained the allegiance of local rulers, further destabilizing French influence. French forces attempted to regain lost ground, but their reliance on reinforcements from Europe and insufficient coordination with local allies hampered their efforts. The combination of superior logistics, disciplined troops, and strategic alliances allowed Britain to gradually expand its control over key trading ports and regional territories. The year 1769 saw escalations on the European continent. Frederick faced a renewed Austrian offensive in Silesia and simultaneous pressure from Russian forces in East Prussia. Winter campaigns were limited, but both sides used the period for logistical preparation, fortification construction, and troop recruitment. Frederick's armies, though smaller, benefited from their exceptional training, while Austrian and Russian forces struggled with coordination issues, inconsistent supply lines, and internal rivalries among commanders. By spring 1769, Frederick executed a rapid march through Saxony, aiming to strike isolated Austrian detachments before reinforcements could arrive. Skirmishes along the Oder River showcased his ability to use terrain advantage, artillery placement, and disciplined infantry to maximize impact. These actions forced Austrian commanders to delay broader offensives, giving Frederick precious time to consolidate defenses in Silesia. Nevertheless, losses remained heavy, with thousands of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Disease continued to take a toll, highlighting the severe human cost of prolonged warfare. Across the Atlantic, British operations in North America focused on consolidating gains along the St. Lawrence River and in the Ohio Valley. French fortifications, including those at Fort Niagara and Fort Duquesne, came under repeated attack. British forces, combining regular troops and colonial militias, leveraged Native American alliances to disrupt French supply lines and communications. By the autumn of 1769, British control over strategic trade routes and settlements was increasingly secure, though sporadic French resistance persisted in remote areas. In the Caribbean, naval engagements continued with notable intensity. Britain sought to dominate shipping lanes, capturing merchant vessels and islands critical for sugar and coffee production. The French and Spanish, though capable of local resistance, faced difficulty projecting power due to disease, limited reinforcements, and the increasing presence of British fleets. These operations had profound economic implications, as control over trade routes directly affected the financing of European armies. India remained a theater of sustained conflict. The British East India Company leveraged alliances with regional rulers to expand territory and secure trading ports. French forces, weakened by distance from Europe and lack of coordination, increasingly struggled to maintain their positions. By 1769, British influence over Bengal and the Coromandel coast had solidified, creating conditions for future territorial expansion and administrative control. The combination of military operations, diplomacy, and strategic economic decisions underscored the complex nature of 18th century colonial warfare. By 1770, the war entered a new phase of attrition and maneuvering. In Europe, Frederick's forces remained outnumbered, but his continued ability to strike isolated enemy units prevented a decisive coalition victory. Skirmishes, defensive fortifications, and small engagements dominated much of the year, with commanders on all sides mindful of the high human and material costs of large-scale battles. Frederick's tactical ingenuity, combined with his soldiers' discipline, ensured that Prussia survived despite formidable opposition. In North America, British operations focused on final consolidation in the Northeast, strengthening fortifications and maintaining Native American alliances. French forces, increasingly isolated, attempted sporadic raids but could not reverse British gains. By the end of 1770, British control over strategic territories, including Quebec, Montreal, and the Ohio Valley, was largely unchallenged. The fall of French positions signaled a shift in the balance of power, with Britain emerging as the dominant colonial power in North America. In India, the British continued campaigns against remaining French enclaves, consolidating territories and establishing administrative systems to govern newly acquired regions. By 1770, French influence had diminished significantly, restricted to minor coastal settlements without meaningful control over inland territories. The success of the British East India Company highlighted the interplay of European military tactics, alliances with local powers, and control of trade routes in determining colonial dominance. Meanwhile, global trade and naval operations maintained the war's intensity across oceans. Britain's naval dominance allowed it to project power, protect colonies, and disrupt enemy commerce, while France, Spain, and their allies struggled to match these capabilities. Disease, attrition, and logistical challenges shaped campaigns as much as battlefield engagements, emphasizing the multifaceted nature of the conflict. By the close of 1770, the 7 Years' War had evolved into a truly global confrontation. Europe remained embroiled in complex maneuvering, North America largely under British control, India increasingly dominated by British forces, and the Caribbean contested through naval power. Frederick the Great's Prussia survived against overwhelming odds, and Britain's expanding empire laid the foundation for future dominance. Yet, the costs in lives, resources, and economic strain continued to accumulate, foreshadowing further challenges in the years to come. The year 1771 marked a period of relative consolidation across multiple theaters of the 7 Years' War. Yet the underlying tensions, rivalries, and ambitions ensured that conflict remained far from resolved. In Europe, Frederick II of Prussia continued to face the combined might of Austria, Russia, and France. Despite being severely outnumbered, the Prussian king maintained a defensive and opportunistic posture, striking isolated enemy detachments and avoiding full-scale engagements unless favorable conditions presented themselves. His forces, though diminished in number from years of attrition, remained among the most disciplined and effective in the world. Austria, still intent on reclaiming Silesia, focused on fortifying key towns and supply lines. The Austrian emperor, under the guidance of Chancellor Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz, continued diplomatic overtures to persuade other European powers to join a coalition against Prussia. Meanwhile, Russia, still recovering from internal reorganizations and leadership transitions, maintained a large but unwieldy force on the Eastern Front. Logistics, disease, and coordination challenges limited their ability to deliver decisive victories. Frederick, aware of these weaknesses, executed rapid maneuvers across Saxony and Silesia, using rivers, forests, and elevated terrain to outflank and harass larger enemy formations. In 1771, North America remained a contested battleground, with British forces gradually consolidating their control over former French territories. The capture of strategic forts along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes Corridor allowed Britain to dominate trade routes and limit French mobility. The French, despite alliances with Native American tribes, struggled to maintain cohesion and effective supply lines. British colonial militias, reinforced by regular troops from Europe, increasingly coordinated operations across multiple fronts, reducing the scope for French retaliation By late 1771, Quebec and Montreal were securely under British influence, though pockets of resistance persisted in remote northern regions. In the Caribbean, British naval forces continued to exert dominance over shipping lanes, allowing them to capture several French-held islands and disrupt the flow of sugar, coffee, and other commodities essential to European economies. Spain, increasingly aligned with France, attempted minor operations to contest British control. But logistical challenges, disease, and the overwhelming presence of British fleets limited their effectiveness. British operations were carefully coordinated, emphasizing blockades, controlled assaults on fortified ports, and selective sieges to minimize losses while maximizing strategic gains. India also remained a key theater. The British East India Company, under Robert Clive and other commanders, consolidated control over Bengal and key coastal settlements. French forces, having suffered setbacks in prior years, attempted to fortify their remaining positions, but lack of reinforcements from Europe and diminishing local support limited their capacity to recover lost ground. The British leveraged alliances with regional rulers, combining diplomacy, economic influence, and military presence to dominate local trade routes and secure resources critical for sustaining long-term operations. By 1771, British control over Bengal, Madras, and other strategic locations was largely established. The year 1772 brought renewed activity across Europe. Frederick the Great launched a series of rapid maneuvers designed to exploit weaknesses in Austrian and French positions. Small but decisive engagements occurred throughout Silesia, Saxony, and western Poland. While full-scale battles remained rare due to the risk of catastrophic losses, Frederick's forces achieved localized successes, disrupting supply lines and compelling enemy forces to divert attention to defensive operations. Disease, attrition, and the ongoing drain on manpower continued to shape campaigns, with thousands of soldiers incapacitated or lost to illness. On the North American front, British operations aimed to consolidate control over former French strongholds and fortify key supply routes. The Ohio Valley and the Northern Territories saw repeated skirmishes between British and French forces, often involving Native American allies. While the French retained the capacity to launch small-scale raids, their diminished manpower and resources left them increasingly unable to challenge British dominance. British victories, combined with effective alliances with indigenous groups, solidified control over critical trade networks and strategic fortifications. In the Caribbean, naval dominance remained crucial. British fleets sought to intercept French and Spanish merchant convoys, capturing valuable resources and further weakening enemy economies. Strategic islands were targeted for sieges or selective occupations, with careful attention paid to minimizing disease-related losses. Spain's engagement with Britain intensified. In 1772, following ongoing attacks on Spanish trade, but British control of sea lanes allowed them to strike decisively, while limiting exposure to counterattacks. India witnessed ongoing consolidation by British forces. Regional alliances strengthened British control, while French forces were confined to smaller enclaves with limited strategic value. Military operations focused on securing trade routes, fortifications, and regional influence. By the end of 1772, the balance in India had shifted decisively in Britain's favor, with French presence largely symbolic and unable to threaten British economic or military interests. The year 1773 marked a critical phase in European and global operations. Frederick the Great faced sustained pressure from Austria and France, while Russia's forces, though numerically superior, struggled to coordinate effectively. Skirmishes and maneuvering dominated much of the European theater as commanders sought to protect supply lines, secure fortified positions, and exploit enemy weaknesses. Frederick continued to employ rapid marches, flanking maneuvers, and disciplined artillery use to offset numerical disadvantages. Despite these efforts, the Prussian army faced continual attrition from combat, disease, and logistical challenges. Across the Atlantic, Britain solidified control over former French colonies. Key victories in Canada and the Ohio Valley ensured secure trade routes and fortifications, while French forces faced diminishing capacity for resistance. Naval operations in the Caribbean focused on maintaining blockades, intercepting enemy shipping, and occupying strategically valuable islands. British supremacy at sea allowed them to project power, sustain supply lines, and reinforce colonial holdings with relative efficiency. India remained a theater of strategic consolidation. British forces leveraged alliances, military fortifications, and economic influence to dominate key territories. French resistance persisted in limited enclaves, but logistical isolation and insufficient reinforcements prevented any meaningful resurgence. By late 1773, Britain controlled the majority of coastal settlements and major trade hubs, laying the foundation for future administrative and military control. By the close of 1773, the 7 Years' War had evolved into a global struggle characterized by maneuvering, attrition, and strategic consolidation. Europe witnessed ongoing skirmishes and localized victories. North America and the Caribbean increasingly fell under British influence, and India became a stage for British expansion. Frederick the Great maintained Prussia's survival against overwhelming odds, while Britain's global influence continued to grow. The war, though far from concluded, was moving toward a stage in which decisive victories and treaties would eventually reshape the balance of power worldwide. The year 1774 began with heightened tension across multiple theaters of the 7 Years' War. In Europe, Frederick II of Prussia continued to defend against Austrian and French pressures, relying heavily on the mobility, discipline, and strategic acumen of his army. Though severely outnumbered, the Prussian king executed targeted strikes to harass supply lines and isolate smaller enemy contingents. Austrian forces, coordinated under the leadership of Prince Charles of Lorraine and supported by French detachments, sought to consolidate control of key territories in Silesia and Saxony. Frederick, aware of the critical importance of maintaining communications and supply routes, utilized rapid marches and fortified positions to avoid entrapment by larger Allied armies. Meanwhile, in North America, British operations against French positions intensified. British forces, composed of colonial militias and regular European troops, coordinated to secure the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes region, and strategic fortifications along major rivers. The capture of Fort Niagara in 1774 represented a key turning point in British dominance, cutting off French access to crucial trade routes and undermining alliances with Native American tribes. French forces, though resilient, were increasingly constrained by dwindling reinforcements from Europe and logistical difficulties in sustaining campaigns across vast distances. The Caribbean remained a theater of strategic importance. British naval forces maintained blockades and targeted French and Spanish shipping, disrupting commerce and weakening enemy economies. In 1774, British forces successfully occupied several strategic islands previously under French control, securing valuable sugar plantations and trade nodes. Spain, increasingly frustrated by British maritime dominance, began to mobilize defensive and offensive operations in collaboration with France. The Anglo-French-Spanish confrontation in the Caribbean illustrated the global nature of the conflict, with European rivalries directly impacting distant colonies and maritime trade networks. India continued to witness the consolidation of British control. The British East India Company leveraged both military action and diplomacy to strengthen its hold over Bengal, Madras, and other critical coastal settlements. French forces, confined to smaller enclaves, attempted raids and defensive operations, but were consistently countered by British forces under the command of Robert Clive and other experienced officers. By the end of 1774, British influence in India was firmly established, laying the groundwork for future territorial and administrative expansion. In 1775, European operations intensified further. Frederick the Great faced renewed Austrian offensives in Silesia, as well as French attempts to coordinate attacks along the western frontiers. Despite persistent numerical disadvantages, Frederick employed strategic ingenuity, including feigned retreats, rapid redeployments, and carefully timed counterattacks. Prussian forces successfully defended critical positions, forcing Austrian and French armies to stretch supply lines and endure attrition from both skirmishes and environmental conditions. Disease, starvation, and fatigue continued to take a toll on all sides, with thousands of soldiers incapacitated or killed by non-combat factors alone. Across the Atlantic, British forces continued to consolidate control over former French territories in North America. The fall of Montreal and the continued British presence in the Ohio Valley severely restricted French influence, disrupting trade and undermining alliances with Native American groups. Colonial militias, supported by regular British troops, fortified key positions and maintained continuous patrols to prevent insurgent activity. French forces increasingly resorted to guerrilla tactics, targeting supply lines and isolated outposts, but lacked the resources to mount sustained operations. In the Caribbean, naval engagements remained central to British strategy. The Royal Navy focused on intercepting French and Spanish convoys, capturing strategic ports, and ensuring the safety of British shipping lanes. The capture of Havana and other key Spanish territories in 1775 highlighted Britain's ability to project power across distant theaters. These victories not only secured valuable resources, but also significantly weakened Spain's capacity to support French operations globally. In India, the British East India Company continued its methodical expansion, leveraging both military prowess and alliances with local rulers. French enclaves, though resilient, were isolated and unable to receive meaningful reinforcements from Europe. The British capitalized on this strategic advantage, solidifying their hold over key trading posts and securing revenue streams essential for sustaining long-term military operations. By 1776, European theaters remained characterized by maneuver warfare, skirmishes, and limited engagements. Frederick the Great's Prussia, though exhausted and outnumbered, continued to resist Austrian and French offensives with remarkable tactical precision. Skirmishes around Saxony, Silesia, and western Poland demonstrated the continued effectiveness of disciplined Prussian troops, even in the face of overwhelming enemy numbers. Attrition, however, increasingly threatened Prussia's capacity to sustain prolonged campaigns, highlighting the fragile balance of power in Central Europe. Meanwhile, Britain's global dominance expanded further. In North America, the consolidation of former French territories, coupled with effective alliances with select Native American groups, solidified British control over critical regions. The Caribbean and Indian theaters similarly demonstrated the British ability to coordinate military and naval operations across vast distances, outmaneuvering French and Spanish forces. By mid-1776, Britain's global strategic position had strengthened considerably, while Prussia remained a formidable, though increasingly beleaguered, power in Europe. As the year drew to a close, the 7 Years' War had evolved into a prolonged global conflict of immense scale. Europe witnessed ongoing tactical maneuvers. North America saw continued consolidation of British influence. The Caribbean remained a contested maritime zone, and India emerged as a stage for British expansion. Frederick the Great's persistence and Britain's global strategy underscored the complexity and intensity of a war that had reshaped the geopolitical landscape across continents. The year 1777 marked a critical stage in the ongoing 7 Years' War, as all participants began to experience the cumulative toll of nearly a decade of global conflict. In Europe, Frederick II of Prussia faced mounting pressure from Austria, France, and Russia. Despite earlier successes, the Prussian king's forces were increasingly strained by attrition, disease, and continuous campaigns across Saxony, Silesia, and western Poland. Yet, Frederick's extraordinary strategic acumen remained evident. Through rapid marches, feigned retreats, and carefully timed counterattacks, he continued to exploit the errors of numerically superior enemies, frustrating Austrian and French commanders who struggled to coordinate their larger, cumbersome armies. Austrian forces, under Prince Charles of Lorraine and other generals, continued to press for decisive victories in Silesia and Bohemia. The Austrians, with French support, attempted several offensives designed to encircle Frederick's Prussian army, but poor coordination and communication failures repeatedly undermined their efforts. The terrain of Central Europe, rivers, dense forests, and hilly plains further complicated large-scale maneuvers, often nullifying the numerical superiority of the Allied armies. Meanwhile, Russian forces, though still formidable in size, remained plagued by logistical challenges, particularly in sustaining supply lines over vast distances and harsh climates. This limited their operational effectiveness, allowing Frederick to focus on defeating isolated segments of the coalition armies. Across the Atlantic, British forces continued to consolidate their dominance in North America. By 1777, Britain had firmly secured Canada following the capture of Montreal, and had established control over strategic forts along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. In addition, colonial militias and regular troops patrolled the Ohio Valley and surrounding areas, suppressing residual French influence and neutralizing small-scale resistance from local Native American groups who had been allied with France. Despite these successes, British commanders remained vigilant, aware that France retained the capacity to launch raids and counterattacks from Caribbean bases or via Native American alliances. The Caribbean theater remained a high-stakes zone of maritime contestation. British naval forces maintained blockades, seized strategic islands, and intercepted French and Spanish trade convoys. The fall of Havana in 1777 represented a major blow to Spanish colonial ambitions and highlighted the increasing global reach of British naval power. French and Spanish fleets, although substantial on paper, struggled with coordination, logistical support, and the challenges of long-distance naval operations. British successes in the Caribbean not only secured vital resources, including sugar and tobacco, but also provided critical staging grounds for operations in both North America and the Indian Ocean. In India, British consolidation continued under the leadership of the East India Company. Following earlier victories, including the capture of Bengal and the decisive Battle of Plassey, British forces methodically expanded control over coastal settlements and inland territories. French forces, though entrenched in smaller enclaves, were increasingly isolated and unable to receive reinforcements from Europe due to British naval dominance. Local Indian rulers, observing the shift in power dynamics, often opted to ally with the British, recognizing the strategic advantage of alignment with a rising colonial power. By the end of 1777, British influence in India was near total, ensuring control over trade routes, taxation, and military logistics. The year 1778 saw intensified European maneuvering as Frederick the Great sought to exploit weaknesses in the Austrian and French coalitions. In Saxony and Silesia, Prussian forces conducted aggressive raids and feints, forcing the Allies to disperse their forces and overextend supply lines. Frederick's use of the oblique order, his favored tactical maneuver, remained central to his strategy, allowing smaller, disciplined units to achieve localized superiority even when surrounded by larger armies. Despite facing continual harassment and attrition, Prussia retained operational flexibility, avoiding entrapment and devastating losses that might have ended its resistance prematurely. Elsewhere in Europe, the French and Austrian commanders continued to vie for territorial advantage, particularly in the Rhineland and Western Germany. The contest for key fortresses and supply depots was fierce, with both sides frequently engaging in sieges, skirmishes, and limited-scale battles. The sheer duration of the war, combined with the strain on finances, logistics, and manpower, forced all combatants to make difficult choices, often prioritizing immediate survival over long-term strategic goals. Across the Atlantic in 1778, Britain solidified its hold on former French territories in North America, while simultaneously preparing for potential escalation against Spain, which had entered the conflict in alliance with France. British forces successfully defended Canada, the Ohio Valley, and critical forts, while launching limited offensive operations to weaken remaining French positions. Despite France's attempts to coordinate attacks from Caribbean bases and French-controlled Louisiana, British control of maritime trade routes and effective colonial administration ensured that French operations were largely constrained. In the Indian subcontinent, the British East India Company continued to expand its administrative and military authority. By this time, the company had effectively neutralized most French influence, controlling key cities including Calcutta, Madras, and strategic ports along the Coromandel and Malabar coasts. The success of British operations in India highlighted the importance of combining military action with diplomacy, fostering alliances with local rulers, and leveraging superior logistics to maintain operational readiness over vast distances. The year 1779 marked the final phase of the 7 Years' War, as exhaustion, attrition, and diplomatic fatigue became decisive factors in ending the conflict. In Europe, Frederick the Great continued to resist Austrian, Russian, and French pressure, employing tactical ingenuity to prevent catastrophic losses. The coalition forces, strained by internal disagreements, logistical difficulties, and diminishing political support, were unable to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Prussia, though battered and resource depleted, survived the conflict intact, preserving its core territories and military capability. Globally, British forces continued to achieve decisive victories. In North America, Canada remained firmly under British control, while former French forts along the Strait, Lawrence River, and Great Lakes were garrisoned and fortified. Caribbean operations secured strategic islands, disrupted French and Spanish trade, and established maritime dominance for the Royal Navy. In India, the British East India Company's authority was uncontested, with French enclaves effectively isolated and local rulers increasingly dependent on British protection and support. By the end of 1779, the 7 Years' War had fundamentally reshaped the global balance of power. Britain emerged as the preeminent colonial and maritime power, controlling vast territories in North America, the Caribbean, and India. Prussia, despite facing overwhelming odds throughout the European campaigns, retained its territorial integrity and demonstrated the effectiveness of disciplined, well-led armies against numerically superior foes. France, Spain, Austria, and Russia had all expended considerable resources and manpower, suffering both territorial losses and internal strains. The conclusion of this protracted conflict set the stage for future geopolitical developments, including the strengthening of British colonial administration, the continued rise of Prussia as a major European power, and the eventual political and economic pressures that would contribute to future revolutions and wars across Europe and the Americas. The 7 Years' War thus stands as a testament to the complexities of global warfare in the 18th century, illustrating how strategic vision, military skill, and logistical endurance could determine outcomes in an era where conflict spanned continents and oceans.